Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our last lecture of the Theological Commons programs this academic year. I want to thank President Jay Rundell and Dean Bridgman, who wasn't here and is here tonight, for being present with us and for supporting the program. Dr. Yvonne Zimmerman is finishing her 10th year as an Associate Professor of Ethics here at MTSO, now also serving as our Associate Academic Dean. Her research covers a broad spectrum from feminist theory and gender and sexuality studies to social theory, human trafficking, and liberation ethics. She has published articles and a book, and often presents in a variety of contexts from professional organizations, universities, and churches. Anyone who knows Yvonne knows that her academic work extends into activism and that her classes are highly sought after by students looking to learn alongside her. The Reverend Dr. Letitia Campbell joined Candler in 2015 as the director of Candler's Contextual Education and Clinical Pastoral Education programs and the inaugural coordinator of the Laney Legacy Program in Moral Leadership. Campbell was named Assistant Professor in the Practice of Ethics and Society last year. Her academic interests are rooted in religion, Christian ethics, engaged pedagogy, and community and international development. She is also published and presents in a variety of contexts as another scholar activist, earning the Emory University Martin Luther King Jr. Community Service Award in 2016 for building public awareness and creating a coalition to abolish the death penalty. No small honor. If you read over both of their abridged bios in your program, you'll notice that both of them went to Emory and were trained by the same ethicists, but they didn't overlap there. Instead, they met later, and I will let Yvonne elaborate on that. We are pleased that the faculty research grant through the Theological Commons could support their joint research that we will hear about tonight, pieces of what is their larger book project. Their research has taken them around the country, and we are eager to hear their perspectives on ending exploitation and human trafficking. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Yvonne Zimmerman and Dr. Letitia Campbell for tonight's lecture.
Good evening, everyone. I am glad to be here this evening, and I am especially pleased to be lecturing with my colleague, Letitia Campbell. Letitia and I met at a conference on human trafficking and religion in 2011 and connected over a perspective. Really, it was a set of suspicions that we realized we shared about human trafficking and the social movement to end it, what we were going to refer to tonight as the anti-trafficking movement.
Now, no one is for human trafficking, so you might wonder what kind of suspicions we shared. I mean, human trafficking is sort of the perfect consensus issue. No matter where you fall on the political spectrum, people from all walks of life and religious identities agree that human trafficking is wrong. But both of us are Christian ethicists, and we're trained in a methodology of doing ethics that emphasizes the importance of paying attention not just to the surface level of moral and political arguments, the rhetoric and words that those arguments take shape in, but also to the actual effect that those words and rhetorical turns enable, the kinds of consequences that they have in real life and the policies that they enable. So we discovered that we shared a set of concerns and questions about the public rhetoric around human trafficking and the perspectives and policies that this rhetoric mobilized.
People talk about human trafficking in a lot of ways and sometimes mean different things by the term. The U.S.'s federal anti-trafficking statute defines human trafficking by the presence of force, fraud, or coercion. Every situation of human trafficking must have at least one of these criteria. Our use of the term human trafficking tracks with the federal definition. We understand human trafficking to refer to situations in which people have lost control of their lives such that they're paid nothing or next to nothing for their work and are not able to leave their situation without fear that they or someone they care about won't be targeted for physical harm as a result. Defined in this way, human trafficking can take many forms and look like a lot of different things. However, the default conception of human trafficking that many Americans carry in their minds is that of young women forced into prostitution by pimps. That is to say, when people hear the term human trafficking, they tend to assume that it refers to commercial sexual exploitation of women and girls, to women and girls selling their bodies, selling sex to men. It's somewhat less likely that human trafficking calls to mind images of workers in meat-packing plants in Nebraska, or migrant laborers picking tomatoes in the fields of North Carolina or Florida, let alone workers in the production lines of factories where cell phones, iPads, and laptops, all things most of us use to facilitate our daily lives, are manufactured. Most people don't think about forced labor generally, but forced sexual labor specifically. The social perception that human trafficking refers to the commercial sexual exploitation of women and children has been carefully cultivated, widely circulated, and is commonly accepted as true.
Now, in this conception of human trafficking, the problem is framed primarily as a problem of morally corrupt men. Men who feel entitled to sex, who prey sexually on vulnerable women and girls, who have no qualms about forcing women to sell sex to others, or about paying for sex themselves. So that is how the problem is generally framed. Opposition to human trafficking, then, takes expression in two primary ways, with two primary types of goals. One is the ideal of restraining and reforming these perverse individuals who are framed as the problem. And the other is rescuing the victims of trafficking. So you see how the paradigm and how it defines the problem generates these two types of responses. And some variation of these two types of goals generally animates the anti-trafficking movement and the kinds of policy initiatives that it aims for. So for shorthand, this whole framework of understanding trafficking and the responses to trafficking, we are going to refer to this throughout the course of the evening as the dominant trafficking narrative. So we're thinking about the problem, the types of solutions it proposes.
So you might wonder, what are we suspicious of? For one, this narrative is easily and often overlaid with powerful racial stereotypes that depict black and brown men as sexual predators. In turn, black and brown men are racially profiled as human traffickers. For example, of the nearly 500 suspects identified in U.S. human trafficking cases between January 2008 and June 2010, 80% were people of color, and more than half, 62%, were black. Racist stereotypes also inflect perceptions of black women and girls who are involved in the street-based sexual economy, depicting them as sexually deviant or promiscuous. In turn, black women are disproportionately profiled and criminalized as prostitutes. For example, in 2014, 94% of the defendants in Brooklyn's Human Trafficking Intervention Court who were charged with loitering for the purpose of prostitution were black. This racial bias extends even to children. According to FBI statistics, over half of the minors arrested on prostitution charges in the U.S. are black. But it's not just race. It's also simultaneously gender. Trans and gender nonconforming people of color are particularly affected by this racial bias, reporting that police frequently invoke the pretext of enforcing anti-prostitution laws to target them for arbitrary stops while they're about daily routine tasks. The term walking while trans emerged out of the shared experiences of police harassment and targeting that is a recurrent part of life for trans and gender nonconforming people. We could go on, and we have written at length about these issues in our published work, which we hope you will read, or maybe already have. But here's the point. We worry about how human trafficking is constructed in the dominant trafficking narrative as a problem of sold sex and immoral men forcing women and children to sell sex, because it suggests that locking bad men up in prison and rescuing good women and girls from the clutches of those who are intent on their harm will bring an end to human trafficking. And bluntly put, we don't think that's the case. We don't think that's the case because human trafficking is not, first and foremost, a problem of individual morality or immorality. Human trafficking is rather a social problem. That is, it arises out of social conditions and processes.
So the dominant trafficking narrative does highlight the way that human trafficking is related to gender justice, and that is a good thing. But human trafficking is related to so much more than gender justice. A truly intersectional and analytical framework reveals that at the same time trafficking is about gender justice, it's related to a whole host of other issues, to racial justice, economic justice, to environmental justice, to the issues of immigration, so issues of refugees and migrants, to justice for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender communities, for formerly incarcerated people, for people living with mental illness and addictions. So this is just a taste. This issue is related to a whole host of other social conditions. And these intersections have to be taken into account if we're going to fully understand what human trafficking is and the interlocking systems that make people vulnerable to human trafficking in the first place. We also need to understand this set of social issues if we're going to understand what needs have to be met in people's lives to make them less vulnerable to human trafficking. And just so that we're clear, we acknowledge that sexual exploitation and violence and abuse do exist. They are real, and they exist in the commercial sex industry, among many, many other places. So wherever these types of violence and exploitation exist, abuse, rape, sexual violation, we want to denounce those as Christians, as people of faith, and as ethicists. And we have to address those harms in all of the places where they exist, whether or not they relate to the exchange of sex for money or any other good of value. But what we reject is the idea that the commercial sex industry is the primary cause or context for human trafficking and these related harms.
As ethicists, we worry that many of the ways that people are encouraged to respond to fight human trafficking in their communities operate out of an awareness of only a single dimension of the issue, while downplaying or even suppressing how vulnerability to human trafficking is related to other social justice issues, things like access to and affordability of safe housing, food, transportation, medical and mental health care, good education, non-militarized public safety, and jobs that pay living wages. Consequently, many well-meaning initiatives end up justifying further policing and surveilling of poor people, people of color, and people who are queer, trans, and gender nonconforming, while doing little to address the actual social injustices that make individuals in these various communities vulnerable to being trapped in trafficking relationships.
We've been working together for almost 7 years now to think about this project. And we've become increasingly articulate and increased our own understanding about the types of interventions and concerns that we think people should not engage in the name of ending human trafficking. But the thing about trafficking is, it is a tremendously energizing issue. So when people learn about trafficking, even when they're persuaded by our argument about the problems with how human trafficking is framed, people want to become involved, and they want to know, what should I do? Where should we start? How can I get involved? So we've heard these questions many, many times. And truthfully, we have struggled to respond to those questions and to inquiries about, which human trafficking organizations we think people should go get involved in and support. So the research that we're going to share with you tonight really grows out of the challenge of those questions and our desire to have better answers to the questions, what should we do?
Last winter, I applied for a faculty summer research grant through MTSO's Theological Commons to support the logistical expenses of visiting several organizations we identified as already doing this work to interview their leadership. These interviews are part of a larger book project Kathy already mentioned that we're working on that is tentatively entitled Christianity, Progressive Politics, and the Movement to End Human Trafficking, that puts progressive Christianity's animating theological vision of a world where there are no excluded ones in conversation with the insights and perspectives of communities who are disproportionately affected by human trafficking. We do this to explore what an alternative to the anti-trafficking tactic of criminalization and rescue might look like. We're both grateful to MTSO for its support of this project and to the Theological Commons, specifically for making these interviews possible.
So now we're going to give you a profile of the 4 organizations that we visited and did interviews with. And Yvonne's going to present the first 2, then I'm going to present the second 2.
Our first interview took me to Fullerton, California, to talk with Meg Valley, who is the founder of the organization formerly known as Abeni, and recently, as in like 2 weeks ago, renamed the Orange County Umbrella Collective. I'm going to refer to the organization as Abeni throughout, simply because it's less of a mouthful to spit out, and a number of the organizations I'm also going to be mentioning along the way also have Orange County in the name, and there's just, you're not going to have a prayer of keeping clear in your mind what I'm talking about. So it has a new name, but I am still working on making that transition in my own mind, so full confession. Meg met me at my hotel on a warm and sunny Saturday afternoon in early August, and we talked at a shady table adjacent to the hotel pool. It was very lovely. Abeni uses a harm reduction model to help adult performers and sex workers negotiate the challenges of working safely within the sex industry and provide support to people who are being domestically trafficked. Meg clarified that Abeni serves people who have been trafficked, but does not identify itself or understand itself as an anti-trafficking organization. This, though, was not always the case. Abeni began in 2009 as a faith-based anti-trafficking organization. Meg explained that the initial idea was to go into strip clubs in Orange County and make connections with dancers and provide resources to help them leave the sex industry. The organization grew quickly. Within several months, they were in 5 or 6 clubs, and in several more months, they were in every club in Orange County. But as the organization grew, Meg began to feel conflicted about what they were doing. She explained that their approach with dancers as supportive, but with an exit-hopeful agenda. And she explained, quote, "As long as we were serving repentant women who'd internalized their stigma, hated sex work, and felt shame about working in the industry, we served a purpose." Her conflict, though, stemmed from the fact that the women they were serving almost inevitably ended up returning to work in the sex industry. As a result, she began to feel that the organization lacked relevance and substance. Additionally, the trafficking survivors they were serving kept mentioning the pressure they felt to conform to and identify with the narrative of the ideal trafficking victim in order to receive services, to be eligible to receive services. This narrative, she said, goes like this. Girl experiences abuse, trauma, or loss. She's addicted or broken, so she enters the industry and experiences more of the same. Then she meets Jesus, repents, gets rescued, leaves the industry, and then some modified version of happily ever after follows. As Abeni served more people, Meg began to realize that there are multiple experiences of the sex industry. She recounted that some people will tell her, "I didn't really hate trading sex, I just didn't like being trafficked." While others will say, "I don't ever want to have to trade sex for money again." And she adds, this is totally understandable because it is not for everyone. The general presumption that the sex industry is always only exploitative and traumatizing to women doesn't match everyone's experiences. What's more, Meg began to see that insisting that people understand their experience in those terms forces them into a box and doesn't allow people the complexity of their own experience. This ate at Meg, and she began to realize that she thinks it's more important for people to be able to tell their stories in ways that make sense to them than it is to try to make their experiences match what professionals or social service organizations can recognize as victimization or human trafficking. In Meg's words, "I want people to have the freedom to explain and still be able to receive services. Just because she refuses to go along with a narrative that you insist is hers, I don't think that's fair. And people wind up resenting the services that they're receiving because it's a one-size-fits-all, and we don't meet people where they're at. I want people to be able to tell their own stories. I want people to stop being forced in a box. I want people to be understood on their own terms." By 2011, Meg no longer believed that exit was the single correct course of action to resource and support someone in the sex industry. she realized that Abeni needed a different approach. So, in 2011, the organization closed to reevaluate and reassess. What happened while they were closed in this process of reevaluation? Meg explained, our questions started to shift. We realized that rather than asking people if they wanted to leave the sex industry and strategizing only around that, we should start asking about how we can help people create agency for themselves. How can we help someone create better options? What can we do to support them in the midst of developing those options and creating that agency? Who can we connect them to? How can we help them develop community? Meg reopened Abeni in 2013, but no longer identifying as an anti-trafficking organization and with a new mission to serve people who work the spectrum of sex work, from those who choose sex work to those who don't really have another choice to those who are forced. She describes the organization's niche as serving people who no one else will. Furthermore, recognizing that help is not a one-size-fits-all, the nature of the services they provide no longer center around the single goal of exit. Meg characterizes it as more harm reduction based, and it's always client-led. She explains, our approach is very much about facing the reality of where people are and then building life support and emotional support and overall holistic support for what that looks like. She repeatedly emphasized the importance of connection, being able to connect people with their community and then being able to connect people with their resources is really important to her. Today, the organization is committed to serving people who are the most underrepresented. We exist to serve people no one else will, she told me. As part of fulfilling this mission, in February 2016, Abeni started working with the Orange County Needle Exchange. The Needle Exchange started as a student initiative of the UC Irvine Medical School and is a volunteer-run, anonymous needle exchange that's grounded in harm reduction and evidence-based principles. It functioned as a mobile unit that's set up each week on Saturday afternoons in the courtyard in front of the Santa Ana Civic Center. They provide access to clean syringes, disposal of used syringes, on-site HIV and Hep C testing, referrals to health, housing, and treatment services if requested, and other harm reduction and safer sex supplies and information. Through the partnership, Abeni has greater access to a different profile of street-based sex workers, including trans people who sell sex with whom she had previously not connected. She emphasized that the needle exchange is more than just needles, though. She has observed that former drug users who have gotten sober frequently come back on Saturdays because of the sense of community that they've developed and because they know it's a place where they can go and get services without judgment or stigma. She shares the example of how Abeni worked with a woman I will call Emily. Emily was a drug user who was getting services through the Orange County Task Force and Victim Services. She got into a treatment center where she had to be sober. But when she achieved sobriety, her eating disorder started to reemerge because the drugs had been her coping mechanism for dealing with it. Without this coping mechanism, all her trauma was beginning to surface, and her vomiting was becoming so frequent and so severe that the treatment center was not sure it had the resources for her to stay in treatment there. Abeni came on board to help find a therapist who specialized in eating disorders and was trained in EMDR to do some work around her trauma. They were also able to add a registered dietitian to her team, and as a result of these different facets of support services, Emily was able to stay in treatment. Because we spoke on a Saturday, Meg invited me to tag along with her to the Orange County Needle Exchange so that I could see the work both of Abeni and the Needle Exchange for myself. Time does not permit me to reflect at length about this, besides to note that this opportunity and seeing Meg relating to this community firsthand gave me a fuller and richer sense of her work and approach to it than I had gotten even through our long conversation together. Several significant themes emerged from this interview. First, I will talk about trafficking and intersectionality. I asked Meg to define how Abeni understands human trafficking, and she explained, quote, the difference between voluntary sex work and trafficking is that generally with trafficking there's force, fraud, and coercion. There's going to be a third party involved. Someone is benefiting, someone's being exploited. But she was adamant. It is never just trafficking. There's frequently an assumption that people who are experiencing trafficking just need to be rescued and then their lives will be fine. Similarly, people are often perplexed or frustrated when the rescue they envisioned appears not to work and people return to the sex industry. This mindset is where Meg started when she first started Ebony. What she has learned is that trafficking is typically just the tip of the iceberg under which there are massive and sustained systemic failures related to gender, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and more. She argues that it's impossible to get trafficking without some conception of intersectionality. A second theme was the importance of continuing to challenge the dominant trafficking narrative with the goal of changing it into something more truthful about the range of experiences people have and how exploitation actually works. The final theme is harm reduction. I asked Meg about Ebony's strength as an organization, like what it does well, what she thinks it does well, and there was no hesitation in her response. We've learned to do harm reduction really well, she said. Rooted in a strong commitment to public health and human rights, harm reduction refers to policies, programs, and practices that use education, advocacy, peer support, and resource provision to reduce the harmful consequences associated with high-risk behaviors or circumstances. Harm reduction recognizes that leaving or escaping from socially oppressive situations or circumstances isn't always a realistic possibility, that by building knowledge, agency, and options, the harm to which people are vulnerable can be reduced and their quality of life improved. The morning after my interview with Meg and shadowing the partnership between Ebony and the Orange County Needle Exchange, I headed to Denver, Colorado, where I was excited to meet Letitia, who was fresh off defending her doctoral dissertation, like the day before, and interview Mary Landerholm from Praxis. The organizational field of social services is full of flux and change. Ebony changing its name to the Orange County Umbrella Collective is one example. Another example is that since my visit in August, the Orange County Needle Exchange has had to shut down after being denied a permit to operate at the Santa Ana Civic Center. Yet another example is that Praxis disbanded and has been closed since October 2015. So you might wonder why I went all the way to Colorado to study an anti-trafficking, or we went all the way to Colorado to study an anti-trafficking organization that technically doesn't even exist. The reason was that Praxis was the only human trafficking organization in Colorado to use a harm reduction model in serving homeless youth and young people, a model that makes it a rarity even in its non-existence. Mary Landerholm was Praxis's interim executive director from 2014 until it closed. She now works as the action plan manager at the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking, which is also in Denver, and we met in their North Denver offices. Praxis began in 2007 as an offshoot of an anti-trafficking organization in nearby Boulder that focused on international human trafficking. A group of students from the University of Denver and Metro State University were interning there and began to realize that trafficking wasn't just an international issue, and they decided to form an organization in Denver to serve domestically trafficked youth and young adults. They incorporated as Praxis. Mary explains that they took an avant-garde approach from the very beginning, opting not to understand trafficking from the traditional dominant narrative, but from an anti-oppression model. The book that she cited as the theoretical and methodological foundation for Praxis's work is probably familiar to many of you, but might be somewhat of a surprise, because it's not a book about trafficking, but it's the classic text, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Praxis used an anti-oppression model that focused on systems and structural violence, and the possibility for individual and collective empowerment to resist that violence. She explained, Praxis really wanted to be able to get the voices of those who were not able to get access to the system, raise those folks as leaders, and have them go out, as Pedagogy of the Oppressed talks about, using their experience as the springboard for their own liberation. We wanted to start to position and platform those folks in the movement, end quote. Praxis's approach held a double personal and professional attraction for Mary. Mary experienced homelessness as a young adult and spent time living on the streets where she sold sex in order to survive. Where she grew up in Illinois, the only organizations offering services were sexual abstinence-based religious groups. I've got this quote up here, I was experiencing exploitation while I was attending a very evangelical church out of Chicago that was telling me these really horrible things about myself, like that I was a sinner and needed to repent. those kinds of spaces that definitely didn't support my process. At that time, I really didn't have the framework or the language for my experience and found that I kept on ending up in these spaces like at the church that just didn't support what I was experiencing and where I wanted to go. And so as a result, a lot of things happened in my journey that didn't need to, that just compounded my experience. When she saw Praxis's model, she immediately resonated with it, thinking about how her life could have been different if something like that had been available to her when she was navigating life on the streets. Like a Benny, harm reduction was a key intervention model for Praxis. Initially, the organization placed a strong emphasis on case management, doing case management with youth and young adults to help them access systems and resources, including informal and underground spaces. For instance, when people resist going to a shelter, they would help connect them with someone running a homeless camp. They also did on-site HIV and Hep C testing for people involved in sex work. Advocacy was another big piece of what they did. We did a lot of advocating for those who did not fit the system, she explained, like trans youth of color. Oftentimes, we'd get service providers that would try to funnel a youth or a young adult into a system that just didn't fit them. We would be that advocate who said, yeah, great, that sounds good, but I need to know X, Y, and Z before I send somebody to you. Or how can we help you shift the way you do your programs internally because we have this big population out there who's seeking services. So there was a lot of advocating for marginalized folks outside of that privileged gender dichotomy, end quote. Lastly, through street outreach and one-on-one conversations with youth and young people living on the streets, they provided low-threshold access to resources. It was this service in particular that built their reputation and credibility in the street community. At the beginning of 2015, Mary recounted that the organization began moving away from case management and toward a community organizing model. They piloted a peer mentorship leadership training to train a team of homeless youth to do street outreach with Mary several days a week. Mary admits that she was highly skeptical about the idea. I didn't think it was going to work. I gave my board pushback on that. Said, this isn't going to work. You can't get people to organize who are in the middle of the muck, because when you think from a social work perspective, like I was, it's like, oh, they need Maslow's hierarchy of needs met before they can engage. But that is not the truth. I was dead wrong, so wrong. I mean, I would have youth beat me to the offices on a snowy Monday morning after they just came out from under a bridge so that they could get it in the community organize and build a response, right? Blew me out of the water. I was so wrong, so wrong. Not only did the youth accompany Mary in doing street outreach, they started to organize around issues that were important to them, like Denver's urban camping ban, the national Ban the Box campaign, and for affordable transit with Denver's new light rail system. So Praxis worked to connect them to those movements in ways that their voices could be heard. But even still, Praxis closed its doors less than 10.5 months later. The primary issue wasn't actually funding. It was burnout. She recounted that board members would just fry themselves because of the difficulty of what they were doing. The difficulty wasn't primarily connected to the services they were providing, but, quote, it was really hard in the context of where we were within the system, always being the odd man out, always being the radical in the room. Always having to hold that space within the system burns people out if they're not supported. We were always in reactive mode, trying to address the backlash of what the system was creating and trying to fill that need. The leadership space was the biggest component. We just burnt the shit out of people. It was really hard work. Mary recounts that in the first 10 months of 2015, Praxis connected with over 15,000 youth and young adults in the Denver metro area. But they were just down to Mary and 2 board members, and Mary realized she couldn't continue to run that way. Dismantling the organization took about 3 months. In that process, sharing all of Praxis's materials and trainings were her priority. They held a forum with all of their stakeholders and community partners where they distributed their resources. But perhaps Mary's main concern was to identify partners who would pick up as much of Praxis's programming as is possible. Attention Homes, that serves homeless youth in Boulder, does harm reduction. The Sex Workers Outreach Project of Denver and the Denver Homeless Ministry picked up the outreach components. Now, more than 2 years later, Mary reports that she still keeps in regular contact with between 40 and 50 of the youth Praxis serves. When we expressed our amazement at hearing this, Mary's response was simply, "They're my community members. Why would I not?" Several significant themes emerged from this interview. The theme that emerged most strongly in the interview transcript was a series of questions Mary kept posing around the work or the value of the label human trafficking. Why is this label important? Why does it matter that an individual identifies as a human trafficking survivor? Does that definition really matter in the middle of a conversation with someone? Who's the label more important for, you or the person who has to carry it? The clear implication is that the label often is not important, or it's not important to the person to whom it would be applied. Like Meg, Mary was clear that applying a label to another person who doesn't identify with it or even rejects it is problematic. The second is that exploitation doesn't happen in a vacuum. Mary emphasized the point that human trafficking, or the talking about human trafficking has to include talking about domestic violence, sexual assault, homelessness, racism, homophobia, gentrification, and the myriad of systems that marginalize people and places them in circumstances where they're vulnerable to exploitation. The third theme is community connections. Throughout the interview, Mary named multiple organizations that were Praxis's community partners. In fact, there was one partnership mentioned that especially piqued our interest. Mary mentioned that as she disbanded Praxis, the Denver Homeless Ministry picked up some of the street outreach that she had been doing with sex workers. The Denver Homeless Ministry is a ministry of the Catholic Archdiocese of Denver and operates in connection with the Knights of Columbus. What caught our attention was not just that Mary relinquished the street outreach she was doing to Denver Homeless Ministry Executive Director Tanya Cangelosi, it was that she and Tanya partner together currently. Mary explained their partnership, saying, she does her section about the crisis services they provide, which is important now that Praxis is gone. They'll contact Tanya if they want to get into substance abuse treatment or are looking for a mental health care provider, needing clothes, hygiene items, or baby formula. And she allows me to do condoms and harm reduction. There's a couple of times during the week that they just do straight outreach and I don't participate, but usually when they're wanting to do sex worker outreach, they'll pull me on to kind of do the dirty work that they can't engage. Though we're on very different, opposite beliefs, we found a really amazing way to work together, end quote. We would emphasize that Praxis is not a faith-based organization and Mary is not a religious person. She and Tanya disagree on a lot, and yet they found a way to work together. Mary spoke about this partnership in such glowing terms and with such respect that we got curious. So curious, in fact, that we decided we wanted to go back and interview both of them together about their collaboration. Mary was generous enough to connect us to Tanya, who agreed to an interview, and so I returned to Denver this past March to talk with both of them. The collaboration works because of the mutual respect they share. Mary doesn't bring out condoms in front of Tanya, and Tanya doesn't talk about religion in front of Mary. True story. They are just very upfront about that. Tanya offered that she's learned from Praxis the importance of giving people back their power, and that to do that, quote, you need to support people where they're at today, not where you want them to be, end quote. This was a rich interview, even if exploring it in depth is beyond the scope of what we can cover this evening. The nugget that I will conclude with are Mary's words. Our partnership shows that collaboration can happen. You can find common ground with people who don't have the same institutional setup. It's doable.
So the third organization that we looked at was the Solutions Not Punishments Coalition. After several false starts at scheduling interviews and 2 cancellations because of extreme winter weather events, I finally sat down with 2 leaders of the Solutions Not Punishment Collaborative, or SNAPCO for short. It was an early day in November, beautiful, sunny, and the 2 people I sat down with were Xochitl Barvara, who's an organizing director at SNAPCO and has been involved in the organization since it was launched in 2013, and Tony Michelle Williams, who has a background in public health and HIV advocacy and has been working at SNAPCO for about 3 years as an organizer. SNAPCO is a Black trans-led coalition comprised of organizations and individuals working to build the power of people most likely to be victims of violence, and most likely to be targeted and harassed by police, particularly trans and gender nonconforming people of color, current and former sex workers, and formerly incarcerated people. And I want to start out here by naming 3 of the themes that emerged in this interview and in my experience of SNAPCO's work, because many of these echo the themes that you've already heard from Yvonne's discussion. SNAPCO's approach is rooted in a commitment to divest from the criminal justice system and fight mass incarceration, a harm reduction approach, and a commitment to building power and agency among Black, trans, and queer communities. Although I formally interviewed SNAPCO's leaders in November, my first encounter with them was more than 5 years ago, just as SNAPCO was beginning to come into formation. And the backstory is an essential part of understanding why we see their work as a counterpoint to the dominant trafficking approaches that we're contrasting them to. In 2013, the Atlanta City Council took up a formal consideration of a proposal for a new city ordinance that would banish sex workers from certain parts of the city for a first offense and from the city limits for a second offense. Now, the purported need for a banishment ordinance, which you cannot read on this screen, I will say, I apologize, according to its promoters, this ordinance was designed to address the nuisance of what they called open-air prostitution, particularly in Atlanta's Midtown neighborhood, which is historically a hub of gay community life, particularly for white gay communities. This proposal happened in the context of Midtown's gentrification, and it was supported by a coalition of business owners and some neighborhood residents. Now, as you can imagine, the proposal of a banishment ordinance, attracted considerable attention in Atlanta and beyond, most of it quite negative. And at the time that this was proposed, Xochitl had just launched the Racial Justice Action Center, which is now supporting a sister organization to SNAPCO. And she was also working closely with Women on the Rise, an organization of formerly incarcerated women. Both of these organizations immediately saw that they needed to be involved in fighting the banishment ordinance, recognizing, in her words, that this is a women's issue, this is a girl's issue. It wasn't until they started talking with the leaders of Transforming, an organization with a long and established record of organizing among trans people of color, that they began to see that the banishment proposal was primarily a transphobic response to trans women of color in Midtown. So the Racial Justice Action Center and Women on the Rise organizers banded together with Transforming and Legender Inc., another Black trans-led organization, to stop the banishment ordinance, along with a whole host of organizations in the city. But they also advocated structural solutions to necessity-based sex work. And it was really in this collaboration that SNAPCO emerged, a coalition of organizations working together on a common project. So organizing against the banishment ordinance not only brought these 4 organizations together, they refer to themselves as anchoring organizations, it also brought them into contact and into work with a wide range of others who opposed the proposal, including the ACLU, the Southern Center for Human Rights, but also many people and organizations who have been important in establishing Atlanta's response to the commercial sexual exploitation of children over the previous decade. So many of these people opposed the banishment ordinance. And they argued that the banishment policy would undermine the city's work to address human trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation of children, that it was a misplaced resources. And so this coalition of Black, feminist, trans-affirming organizations, they found common ground with the anti-trafficking movement in the city. But even as they worked to take banishment off the table, some of the distinctions between their respective approaches of analysis became hard to ignore, and they were really highlighted in these hearings about the banishment ordinance. So Xochitl reflected, what was beautiful about getting involved in the banishment campaign was that all the anti-trafficking folks showed up, as you remember, predominantly white, cis, straight people with their pictures of victims in their own head and how they talked about it. The powerful testimony of trans women of color at the banishment ordinance hearings often focused attention on the problems of police profiling, police harassment and violence, including stories about the demands of the police for sexual favors from people who were being profiled as sex workers. And this really challenged the images of trafficking victims that many people in the room had brought to these hearings. So these women who sold sex were not necessarily ashamed, and they weren't helpless victims. That's not how they presented themselves. They weren't passively waiting to be rescued. So this was a challenge. And Xochitl recalled a particular community leader who got up to testify, and she says this: you could tell it just messed up their whole paradigm. You know what I mean? Because to see her as a victim, you just couldn't. She was like, victimhood isn't what makes me valuable or makes this fight important. I traded sex because I needed a livelihood. I needed a fucking job. I needed a place to live. And I am not ashamed. I'm not sitting up here like, oh, that's terrible and horrible. I'm like, y'all need to do something about it. So after the defeat of the banishment ordinance, then Atlanta Mayor Kasim Reed started the Working Group on Prostitution. This was in lieu of the banishment ordinance, which had just gone down in flames and with very bad publicity for the city. And SNAPCO's members continued to be a steady presence at those meetings. And it was really in this context that the name Solutions Not Punishment began to emerge. And the group became increasingly articulate about their demand for a focus on solutions, but also articulate about the fact that they were not the problem that needed solutions, that the problem was the systems and policies that marginalized and exploited them. So to go back to some of the themes from this interview, SNAPCO defines the primary problem that they exist to address as one of mass criminalization and incarceration. And this shapes everything about how they approach their work. And as you can see, this is a pretty substantial departure from the dominant trafficking narrative that we've talked about. SNAPCO is guided by a commitment to ending mass incarceration and addressing the harms of the criminal justice system. And this is clearly stated on their website. And in community meetings, they often hand out a flyer that lists guiding principles so that new people who are coming to their meetings for the first time will understand this campaign does not support incarceration for survival sex or low-level drug offenses, nor do we support solutions that in any way expand the criminal justice system or worsen the crisis of mass incarceration. So you get this on a half sheet when you come into the room. In 2016, SNAPCO released a report called "The Most Dangerous Thing Out Here is the Police." And this drew a sobering picture of how pervasive experiences of police profiling, harassment, and arrest were among queer and trans communities of color in Atlanta. So they'd interviewed 80-something people to put together this report. And it was highly critical of the police department, the Atlanta Police Department. So 80% of trans women of color reported having been approached or stopped by an APD officer in the previous year. 8% of trans women surveyed reported having been forced to engage in sexual activity or receiving other unwanted sexual contact from APD officers in the last year. And 38% of trans women of color reported calling the police for help and being arrested. So as you can see, this was not a good look for the Atlanta Police Department. And when the report came out, the mayor's office called them and said they wanted to appoint a trans person to the Atlanta Civilian Review Board for the first time, and that did happen. So the coalition has achieved some other major successes, and of particular note is that in the first 2 years after the defeat of the banishment ordinance, SNAPCO secured funding and community support for the Atlanta Fulton pre-arrest diversion program. And this actually passed on unanimous votes in both the Atlanta City Council and the Fulton County Board of Commissioners. The pre-arrest diversion program is a harm reduction approach to handling sex work and quality of life arrests. So it allows police who have a probable cause for arrest to decide, instead of arresting someone, so before the point of arrest, before the arrest actually takes place, to divert that person to services that are provided by the pre-arrest diversion program. So it keeps them out of the criminal justice system entirely. And in this way, it differs from a lot of other diversion programs, which are after arrest, but before the point of sentencing. So people still have an arrest on their record. In addition to the pre-arrest diversion program, which is now spun off to be its own organization, they have a mobile unit that police can call in if they want to divert someone. SNAPCO has worked with local law enforcement organizations, not just in the city of Atlanta, but in the region, to develop standard operating procedures for interacting with trans and gender nonconforming individuals. And I said they've worked with some, they've forced other law enforcement communities to take this up. They've also been key players in a campaign to reduce marijuana possession in the city of Atlanta to be a misdemeanor, a ticketable misdemeanor. So instead of being locked up, the police can just give you a ticket. And also an ongoing campaign to end cash bail for low-level offenses. Now, in the last mayoral election in Atlanta, every major mayoral candidate supported the change in marijuana classification, possession classification to misdemeanor. So this is really a remarkable set of achievements. And so they've currently announced that they're in the early stages of a campaign to shut down the Atlanta City Jail. The third theme that I want to just mention is one that I find tremendously moving. SNAPCO has been involved in, they work to build power and agency among Black, trans, and queer communities. So they do that in a couple of ways. They've developed a leadership development program, the Trans Leadership Connection, which, as their name suggests, does leadership development with interns, with trans interns. They put on a regular program of freedom schools to provide political education to their communities around a number of issues. And throughout all of this work, whether it's advocacy work, base building, leadership development, community empowerment, there is a strong sense of relationship. And this comes through quite clearly in the interview transcript when you read it. They talk about our folks, our community. As Tony Michelle put it, Solutions Not Punishment is not an organization, it's not even really a coalition, it's a community. And there's no doubt that SNAPCO strives to build an empowered community and sees community as a key part of healing and safety. In her eloquent words, a big part of what we do is empower folks to be their full, authentic selves. That's our vision for a new Atlanta. And in that, there's no shaming. There's no shaming in that. So how we lead our folks and be with our folks and live with our folks is just really listening to their stories and advocating for their needs. One thing we say is that we are the experts on our own lives. We know what we need to generate safety. We know how to be, and we know how to have autonomy over our own lives and our bodies. We try to empower people from that place. So the final organization that we're going to describe is Thistle Farms, which is located in Nashville, Tennessee. Thistle Farms is a social enterprise initiative that employs residents and graduates of Magdalen House, a residential rehabilitation program for women who are survivors of trafficking, prostitution, and addiction. And of all the organizations that we've spent time with in this project, Thistle Farms is the oldest and the best known, especially within church and anti-trafficking communities. So how many people have heard of Thistle Farms before? Okay, so a handful. And in contrast to the other organizations we've looked at, Thistle Farms does not take a harm reduction approach. Also, unlike the other organizations we've discussed so far, Thistle Farms identifies itself as an organization whose specific mission is to serve women survivors of human trafficking. And they've received quite a bit of attention in the media, and mainstream media and church circles for their work. So for these reasons, Thistle Farms actually was not one of the organizations that we initially planned to explore in our research. I mean, partly because we had in mind research that would lift up and illuminate organizations that had models that were less well known and that have been sort of left out of the conversation. But a short conversation changed this, and here's a connection. About the time we were starting our work, and this, the SNAPCO community in Atlanta was beginning to talk about how to address severe barriers to housing and employment faced by trans people of color in the city. And in that context, one of the leaders of Transforming, one of SNAPCO's anchor organizations, reminded me that he and I had been seated together a few years before at a luncheon for Thistle Farms founder Becca Stevens. And he told me that he was impressed with the model of Thistle Farms because of the way it prioritized economic empowerment and independence. It was clear to me that any program that aimed to address the underlying causes of vulnerability for trans people of color would have to address issues of economic agency as a key issue. So on his recommendation, in November of last year, Yvonne and I drove from Atlanta to Nashville to attend a full-day training, an education workshop for people who are interested in replicating the Thistle Farms model in other cities. The day began with presentations by founder Becca Stevens, and the organization's brand new CEO, followed by tours of the social enterprise and residential components of the program, lunch, and then finally a panel presentation by the staff who support the residential treatment program. So Thistle Farms' mission is to heal, empower, and employ women survivors of trafficking, prostitution, and addiction. We do this by, this is the mission statement, we do this by providing safe and supportive housing, the opportunity for economic independence, and a strong community of advocates and partners. We believe that in the end, love is the most powerful force for change in the world. So today, Thistle Farms operates a holistic 2-year residential program that provides housing, medical care, therapy, education, and job training free of charge for up to 32 women at a time. Residents and graduates of this program are then employed in one of the organization's social enterprises. So these include a natural body and home product company and a newly opened or I think newly renovated cafe attached to the complex of buildings that houses their offices, as well as a center that supports their global network of women producers that they help to distribute and sell handmade products and share the economic empowerment from those sales with women around the world. And then finally, in addition to these components, Thistle Farms is developing a growing national and global network of sister organizations in cities across the country and a few internationally who are dedicated to driving systemic change by utilizing the same kind of model that Thistle Farms has developed to connect survivors of prostitution, trafficking, addiction, and abuse to healing and empowerment. So on the day we went to the training, nearly 100 people who were interested in becoming part of this network filled the room. Over lunch, sort of in the middle of the day, we interviewed Becca Stevens in a nook just off the hallway of the organization's main office. And I have to say, it was immediately obvious when we sat down that Becca's charismatic and relational style of leadership, which is an important part of the organization's public profile, infused the entire organization. So almost everyone who walked by us in the hallway stopped to say hello, to talk about organizational business, family updates, holiday plans. So she's really a hub. When Becca Stevens launched Magdalene House as a residential program in 1997, she was working with women who had histories with prostitution or drug addiction. The program was small. It operated out of a single home in a residential neighborhood in Nashville, and there was a community of just 5 women. At the time, in the late 90s, the language of trafficking was not in wide usage, especially not in reference to the United States. So Becca explained to us, when I started out, there was no term called trafficking. Then the evangelicals started using this language, and I was like, sex slaves, modern day sex slaves. I was like, oh boy, this is some hot language. And this is what she said, we've somewhat co-opted this language because there's good and bad parts of it. The good part is that people do remember that a lot of times people were criminalized, before people were criminalized, they were victimized. And that's a gift of the term in some ways for me. The bad part of the term is, one, how sensationalizing it is, and then also how it's almost like women don't have any agency or choice. So at the same time that she's taken up this term trafficking, she's also resisted some of the mythology that's developed around the idea of trafficking, and in particular, the oversimplification of narratives about rescue. In her words, when you're talking about the myths around all of it, everywhere I go now, it's like everybody has these cards for healthcare workers so they can rescue people, or for your church, and here's the 4 questions you can ask to know if they should rescue everybody. First of all, it's so awkward. Can you imagine? Are you under anyone's control? So you can see she's taking up this term, but with ambiguity and with hesitation. So Stevens distinguishes between trafficking and prostitution by suggesting that women may turn to prostitution or continue to engage in the sale of sex after they've been initially forced or coerced into selling sex. So while she articulates a different understanding, a different perspective of the relationship between trafficking, prostitution, and sex work than the other interviewees that we met with, what she and Thistle Farms do share with the other organizations we've described is that they're insistent on naming the deep connections between vulnerability to trafficking and a range of other social factors and experiences, including experiences of abuse, violence, and addiction, as well as economic vulnerability and social marginalization. As Becca occasionally puts it in her reflections on her work, the women at Magdalen House had seen the undersides of bridges, the short side of justice, and the backhand of anger long before they saw the inside of prison walls. So this complex or ambivalent engagement with the term trafficking was one important theme that emerged from our conversation with Becca Stevens and our time at Thistle Farms. There are two other themes that I want to name. And both of these themes reflect a recognition of the way in which experiences of trafficking, prostitution, abuse, and addiction often intersect in the lives of women and make it difficult for them to regain a sense of agency over their lives. So one is the emphasis on community and recovery. Thistle Farms residential program, Magdalen House, which is expanded now from its original 5 members to more than 30, is organized around 24 spiritual principles. And it emphasizes the central role of community in supporting sustained recovery and growth of residents. This approach is shaped by 12-step recovery models, even though it's not a precise connection. And it reflects the kinds of practices of group support that are part of those models. Becca Stevens also points further back. She often talks about the influence of the 6th century Benedictine rule on the way she thinks about women living in community in these houses, that it's grounded in hospitality, reverence, and love. In the program's own words, as part of their mission statement, we believe that love is the most powerful thing in the world, that love is more powerful than all the forces that drive women to the street, and surrounding each woman with a strong community of advocates will help them to begin their journey home. So this emphasis on community is really vital. The final theme I want to mention is one of economic empowerment. If the residential program at Thistle Farms draws heavily on models of addiction and recovery, emphasizing spiritual principles and community, the social enterprise component of the organization leans into the focus on economic empowerment. So women graduate from the program and they move into full-time work at one of these social enterprises. They receive a living wage of $13.25 an hour plus full benefits. And as Becca describes it, this isn't really an opportunity for them to grow into leadership and be part of an organization that understands itself as a movement as much as a company. So this is how Becca put it. This social enterprise program, it's not being done for women. It's not a sheltered workshop where you make candles for 6 months and then good luck. You come in and we're growing a movement and a company together. It's a very laborious way to do the work, and it's awesome because everyone's changed by the end of it.
So what are our most powerful takeaways from this series of interviews? While each of these organizations has distinct features and histories, there are clear themes that resonate across the set, which I think you can mostly read here.
These themes that we've talked about are rich resources for us as Christian ethicists to begin raising questions like, how might Christian communities engage practically with organizations like the ones we've profiled? But also, how might that engagement change, challenge, or deepen the Christian theological and ethical commitments that draw Christians to that sort of work? And these are questions that we will be wrestling with as we move into the next stage of our research, but I hope we'll have some time with you tonight to begin thinking about those questions as well.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. I am completely persuaded by your skepticism. And in fact, you gave me an idea about doing research on the organizations that don't work, because I feel like I've been really in connection with them a lot. As, you know, I mean, it's true in terms of, you know, the rhetoric about the rescue and, you know, and all of that you've mentioned. But I wanted to ask a question about the very beginning, you know, when you laid the foundation of your skepticism about the rhetoric of language and the fact that sex trafficking in particular has become, you know, the glamorized version that covers and hides. So I have my own theory, but I'm really, you know, interested in your perspective. Who benefits from that? Like, why is it that it's so clear to some of us, you know, the intersectionality, the problems of the market, the economy, the globalization, you know, the vulnerability to economic disempowerment, and yet that is what the media and some faith organizations, as you named, and a whole host of policies are all, you know, invested in making that the front page news. So.
I don't think there's just one answer to that, first of all, but one of the things that I observe that the dominant trafficking narrative appeals to is the white savior complex, which is the idea that you can feel like a moral hero. You've gone and you've rescued somebody. So that's not an economic benefit necessarily, but it is a promise that sells. You can change somebody's life, and that is incredibly seductive. Absolutely.
Well, and this may be a very obvious answer, but by focusing attention in this way, it reduces our need or ability to ask questions about the ways many forms of labor are structured in our economy. So, you know, we pointed at the beginning to agriculture, to sweatshops. There are many conditions that people are working under that are not humane. Some of those might fall, you know, under the legal umbrella of trafficking, and others do not. But reducing the amount of time people spend focused on questions about labor trafficking preserves that structure of our economic life.
I want to thank you both as well for your presentations. I actually happen to know 3 of these 4 organizations. 2 of them I know fairly well. So I wanted to ask you something about SNAPCO particularly. You're looking at the way they source the work they do. I wonder if you had any conversation with them about their interactions, particularly with, in Atlanta, at least 2 queer-led black churches that are deeply connected to SNAPCO, and what they say about how they experience both the negative part of the church and then the support of this church. Because I also know that they have been working with Ebenezer on the cash bond thing.
And cash bail.
Cash bail thing, but they don't particularly like Ebenezer. So I just wonder if, I mean, you know, we work with who we work with, but I wonder if there was any conversation with them around that.
Well, it's interesting you asked that. So one of the interests that deepened for us as we progressed through this series of interviews was this question about collaboration with churches. You know, we picked organizations, you know, in a bit with the exception of Thistle Farm, because Becca Stevens is an Episcopal priest, but the rest of the organizations we talked to are not faith-based organizations in a formal sense. Now, many people in those organizations, at least I will say in the case of SNAPCO, many people in those organizations are deeply spiritual and rooted in a variety of, they describe that identity in a variety of ways. But after Yvonne went back to do the second interview in Denver about the collaboration with Denver Homeless Ministries and street outreach, I started to get curious as well about doing some more interviews that really focus on questions about how these organizations interface with churches. So one of the things I'm curious about is exactly what we saw in that case in Denver. How do communities of faith who might have disagreements with organizations about certain aspects of their analysis or certain practices, how can they find ways to collaborate regardless? And how do communities of faith, faith leaders, lay people, how do people make sense of that kind of collaboration? So I am hoping to do some more interviews in Atlanta around that exact question. SNAPCO has worked with clergy, black clergy in particular, a good bit, doing education and collaboration. So yeah, I'd love to talk more about that.
Thanks. I have two questions. First, you said one of your organizations made a distinction between prostitution and sex work in their definition, and I was wondering if you could lay out like how they define a difference in that and how that changes how they engage with folks who are in prostitution or sex work. And also, are there any organizations doing this kind of work in Ohio?
I'll answer the first part of the question. I'll let Yvonne take the second part. I'm guessing that the organization you're referring to is the Thistle Farms, the fourth one. And so I'll tell you what I understood Becca Stevens to be saying in that part of our conversation. She was making a distinction between trafficking and prostitution. And the point she was making is that I think her general sense is that while people might choose to participate in sexual commerce or to sell sex, that almost always is part of a longer story in which they have previously experienced harm, including trafficking. So what she says in the interview is people might engage in prostitution after they've already been trafficked. So what she's getting at is that people experience harm, and that shapes their experience, their choices, and that's how she understands prostitution. I think she would say it's not really a choice. It's that people have been victims, and this is part of the result of that. She actually strongly dislikes the term sex work. So when we asked her about whether she uses that term, she said she does not use that term. Because she says, what kind of work is it when the rate of violence is so high that people don't choose that of their sort of free will, that these are constrained choices.
We actually
I think that's accurate.
No, that is inaccurate of what she said.
Yes.
We were thinking we could actually name a number of professions where people systematically and regularly express harm that get to count as work.
But I will say that perspective is very widespread. And so it's been people have a variety of perspectives. I don't want to say everyone thinks exactly the same, but that perspective on sex work and prostitution and trafficking and how they're related is fairly common, not unique to Becca Stevens.
In terms of answering your question about Columbus, so the first thing I want to say is that I am not an expert in the entire range of social service organizations that exist here. There are pieces and parts. For example, there is a needle exchange that is run by Veritas Health, I want to say. There is a number of sort of social enterprise-y-ish organizations, like She Has a Name. There's also one that makes candles. I can't think of its name off the top of my head. And there is not a pre-arrest diversion program, but there is, Franklin County does have a specialized docket for victims and survivors of human trafficking called Catch Court. Now, that is not a pre-arrest diversion program, but it is a diversion program of sorts. It's arranged a little bit differently. But in terms of saying like, there's also Star House, which provides services to street-based and homeless youth. I'm not exactly sure if they would describe themselves based in harm reduction, although some of what they do resonates with it. What? Kaleidoscope. Oh, Kaleidoscope does, yeah. So pieces and parts, but it's not quite as easy as saying like, yeah, there's this organization that is like Thistle Farms, and there's that organization that functions like a Benny.
Last question.
Unless somebody else wants My question is kind of back to the beginning, Yvonne, but Letitia too, and thanks both of you for really an excellent presentation. I was impressed by Meg's t-shirt, number one. I thought that was an advertisement for your project. That revolution is intersectional. That was great. But the question I've got is about her journey in 2011 to 2013. And as you talk to her, but again, both of you on this, theological ideas that may have kind of emerged for her as she went from kind of where she was thinking about the task that she was involved in to where she ended up. And then I think the second part of that is for folk like us involved in resourcing folks in that journey, how might we be engaged in what kinds of theological things would we want to introduce into that conversation so that folks could go from where she was in 2011 to where she ends up in 2013. I think that's maybe a practical takeaway for us as well.
That's a great question, and I'm going to let Letitia answer the theological piece of that because she's actually a far superior theologian to me. So the interesting thing about Meg is she does identify as a Christian, and she would probably say that she's becoming less evangelical, but that is clearly the tradition that has shaped her, and in many ways that is her first language. So even as in the course of our interview, she was talking about really following God's leading and just believing and following what God has next for us and so on and so forth. So that's really, that's her framework, even though the organization itself is not a faith-based organization. She's very clear that it is an expression of her faith, but it is not, it doesn't exist to like propagate her faith. I'll be really honest. I'm not really sure that theology was the leading edge in that change. I think that it was, in some ways, things that we might talk about as religious or theological virtues out of which she was operating. So I think she was operating out of a sense of deep compassion, and that was leading her, and being aware that the narrative about what it means to be a victim of human trafficking and sort of how you have to frame your story, that sort of watching folks struggle with that and it not fit, that it was her compassion that led her to say, hey, we've got to make a change because we can't lead with the narrative. We have to lead with people's experiences and what makes sense. So definitely there was some theological work happening, but she's not theologically trained. And so that wasn't sort of how it was led in our conversations. It would have been an interesting question to ask her.
I think your question about what theological resources are valuable in helping people along in these conversations, or helping people to be better listeners to the communities that they encounter, is a really good one. So I'm going to be continuing to think about that. There are two things I'll say. I'm just sort of looking at these themes and thinking about the theological ideas that intersect with them. So one that comes to mind very clearly for me is the ability to honor the dignity and knowledge that people have about their own lives. So when Tony Michelle says, we are the experts on our own lives, and the ability to have the humility to listen to people's analysis of their own situation and learn from that and be in conversation with that, that's a spiritual practice as much as a theological idea, but they're related. So I think that's one. I think the other, you see woven through many of these themes an emphasis on intersectionality and on social analysis of economic conditions, of social marginalization, and so forth. And I think that helping people to shift ideas about sin from being about individual morality, which is so pervasive an idea that permeates our culture, but shifting the way we think about sin, or expanding the way we think about that, so that it's not about individuals, but that we think about social sin and the structures of oppression that carry that, I think is a very, very critical part of what we should be doing as theological educators. And the details of how that gets worked out in people's encounters with communities and learning about the people and communities they love and care about and are part of, that is the details of the contextual work, of theology and analysis. Thank you for that question, though.
Well, Yvonne, Letitia, we could be in conversation with you all night. We look forward to your book. Let's thank them.